the story of my cousin and Wyatt Earp. That is to say, my first cousin 3 times removed. My third great-grandfather was Charles Crockwell. One of his sisters was Martha Crockwell. And this is about Martha's daughter, Hyrel Gill, who married a man named George Gill. You might wonder, when's Wyatt Earp coming into this story? That's the Arizona connection, right? But this really isn't a story about Arizona. It's a story about Los Angeles, about murder, suicide, infidelity, passion, a trial, more murder. Ultimately, it's a trial in which Wyatt Earp testified before he moved to Los Angeles when he was living in Parker, Arizona. And then I think he moved to Los Angeles. Let's get to the story. It starts in Pasadena in July of 1907, where Estelle Corwell, who had been living with a man named George Bennett, according to at least one newspaper article, and they were pretty hyperbolic in those days. And I do have to read some of this because it just gets, there are multiple newspaper articles about this trial, and they all have something to say. This one's a hoot right here. The title is Eyes Gleam Through Veil. Miss Corwell's face bared only for a moment. Women crowd the courtroom to see the slayer. Mother of victim yields to strained faints. Estelle Corwell, who on the night of July 22nd followed George Bennett to the home of his sweetheart and there shot him to death, was held for trial in Superior Court on murder charges. When Miss Corwell appeared, there was a general craning of necks. But all looked in vain, for her face was concealed by a heavy black veil. Now, this is not Hyrel Gill. This is not my cousin. This is a trial that had something to do with her, or which she had something to do with. Also Wyatt. Spectators, the figure with drooping shoulders and the heavy mourning veil seemed pitiful. And there are drawings where she is really heavily veiled, all in black, and she's got like this massive 1908 hat on, Victorian, and she's like looking very sad and grim. Miss Corwell seemed to know that she had the sympathy of the women present. At times, her shoulders shook as though she was racked with grief. Her relatives, too, sitting near her, were sobbing through pity when the name of the man she had loved was mentioned, when the ghastly details of the course taken by the bullet were told on the witness stand. The woman's head dropped lower till it almost rested on her breast. Her bosom heaved, and her body quivered as though shaken with sobs. But the glare from the skylight shone directly on Miss Corwell's veiled face. That face was turned toward the witness stand. Her head had sunk on her breast. I spent a lot of time talking about that. But the eyes were alive with feeling. Those great black eyes that had once been Bennett's delight seemed sparkling with fire. They fairly gleamed through the heavy veil. First upon the face of the witness, then upon the justice's face, and then upon the countenance of the men and women about her. Those eyes were focused. Not a half-dozen men in the room could catch the gleam from those eyes, but they seemed to show that the woman was alive to her danger. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, her body subservient to her lightest wish, but her eyes fought for her life. Her face was bared for a moment. The eyes then showed no emotion. The supposed sobs that had shaken her body had left no trace on her face. The rich red color of her cheeks had not been dimmed by the hours of prison living. If she had suffered an agony of remorse, her countenance did not reveal it. Her lips were drawn into a thin line. For just one moment the eyes looked out upon the courtroom, then the veil was dropped. A moment later a witness began to speak, and then beneath the veil those eyes began to gleam again. So here's kind of what happened. This Estelle Corwell was living with a man named George Bennett back in, I believe it was Pasadena, in 1907. This Mr. George Bennett was seeing some other young little gal, also last name Bennett, no relationship. Somehow he got himself murdered, and apparently a witness reported that a woman in a white hat was seen leaving his apartment. Now, how my cousin comes into play was she testified that Estelle Corwell, known to her, I'm not really able to ascertain whether they were really friends, but known to her, did not possess a white hat. She only had black hats. My dear cousin featured in this trial. I mean, she gets a big old picture, and I know it's her because in a box of photographs that I got from an 80-something-year-old relative, were some 1800 photos, and although one does not say it is Hyrel Cheney, it's clearly her, and I'll show you the young photo of her. Anyway, Mrs. Hyrel Gill is an important witness in the Corwell murder trial. Okay, but how? Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill was recalled as the first witness for the defense yesterday. She said she had secured a receipt from Hoagie's store for a bunting suit delivered to Miss May Bennett early in 1906. This suit is said to have been purchased by George T. Bennett, and the circumstance, according to the defense, had the effect of causing great mental depression on the defendant. So Miss May Bennett would have been the young lady that George Bennett was dating, even though he was theoretically living with this Estelle Corwell. I know, how does Hyrel Gill get in there, and where's Wyatt? I'm getting in the trial. The prosecutor was kind of dogging, basically, Hyrel Gill for acting as a detective. There's a little line in this article, not a detective. Mrs. Gill declared in reply to Attorney Blair that she had not acted as a detective on behalf of Mrs. Corwell. Demanded Blair, "Did you not go to the store and represent yourself as May Bennett?" "I did not. I got the original bill for the suit. They know me at the store as I've had dealings there, and they did not object to giving me the bill." Now, you've been acting as a detective and talking to the witnesses for the prosecution as they came up, have you not? Asked the attorney. "Not to my knowledge. Anything I have done has been from motives of kindness. I have talked about the ease to witnesses, but said nothing that could be of importance to you," said Hyrel. "It was your purpose to find out everything you could?" "Naturally, yes," she said. "I told everyone that I thought would help the case." Attorney asked, "Were you not in this room when testimony was being taken?" "Not since Friday," said Hyrel. "Well, I am speaking about the time prior to that day." Hyrel, "Well, I'm speaking about the time since," with asperity. Pursed lips, for sure, you just know. The color of the hat worn by Mrs. Corwell on the night of the shooting was again brought into the case when the proprietress of the Venice apartment stated she saw the defendant wearing a black hat that night. Here comes Wyatt. Wyatt S. Earp of Kingman, Arizona, was called to testify concerning the health of Mrs. Corwell's father, whom he knew some years ago. Let me interject here. There appears to have been a situation where Estelle Corwell's attorney was asking for a plea of not guilty due to insanity. So they were looking for insanity in her family or ill health of any kind. That's where Wyatt Earp comes in, of all things. Wyatt S. Earp of Kingman, Arizona, was called to testify concerning the health of Mrs. Corwell's father, whom he knew some years ago. Dr. Campbell, in his testimony, said the defendant, that would be Estelle Corwell, had told him the day after the shooting there had been no disease in her family. Earp said he knew the defendant's father during the 80s, and he was then suffering with Bright's disease. We'll stick with Wyatt for a minute. In another article, it says Wyatt S. Earp, whose name is one of the, quote, Earp boys, is identified with the early and strenuous days of Arizona, was recalled today by the defense to impeach the testimony of Dr. Campbell, who stated that Mrs. Corwell told him there had been no disease in her family. In answer to a question by Mr. Appel, Mr. Earp stated that he knew Tom Goodman, father of the defendant, Estelle Corwell, and that he knew him to have been a sufferer from Bright's disease. Bright's disease is actually an old term for kidney disease, chronic kidney disease. Another newspaper article. Mrs. Gill on the witness stand in Corwell case. I don't know how Hyrel became the headliner for this thing, for goodness sake. The end of the Corwell case is in sight. Arguments probably will be concluded Wednesday night and the case may reach the jury by that time. Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill, Cheney Gill, was on the stand again Tuesday morning. Mrs. Gill has been active in behalf of the defense and has gathered much evidence. She said Tuesday morning that she did it out of mere kindness of the heart for Mrs. Corwell. Gill denied that she was a detective in the matter and made it plain that she could take care of herself on the witness stand. Wyatt Earp, famous old-time gunfighter, was called to testify that he knew Tom Goodman, Mrs. Corwell's father, and that Goodman had Bright's disease for years. This was to controvert Dr. Campbell's testimony to the effect that Mrs. Corwell told him there had never been any sickness in her family, and to make a further point in the insanity plea. It being stated as a fact that sufferers from Bright's disease frequently have fainting fits and hallucinations. There was additionally a question during the trial of whether George Bennett and Estelle Corwell had represented themselves as husband and wife. Josephine or Sadie Earp testified that in fact they had known the Goodmans and that they had been to Mrs. Corwell's house where she was living with Mr. Bennett, and that they had represented themselves as husband and wife. Long story made not too awfully short, Estelle Corwell was acquitted just straight up. I don't believe there was a reason of insanity. She was just found not guilty. Everybody erupts in happiness or joy except for the family of Mr. Bennett. I kind of followed Estelle's progress through life. I didn't realize her nickname was Stella. I should have known that. She ended up living with her family for a while. She had a lot of siblings too. Her mother remarried and she had quite a few children. Stella married in 1927 a man 20 years younger than her. And he died, not murdered, he died of appendicitis in 1936. And she herself died in Los Angeles in 1948. When I was reading one of the articles, there was a paragraph in there that got my attention, and I was like, what? When did this happen? I've already read part of it to you, but I'll read it again. Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill was on the stand again Tuesday morning. Mrs. Gill has been active in the defense and has gathered much evidence. She said Tuesday morning that she did it out of mere kindness of heart for Mrs. Corwell. This article is dated February 18th, 1908. The next line is, Mrs. Gill's husband shot and killed a Mrs. Watkins and killed himself at the Redondo a few weeks ago. When Deputy District Attorney Blair began to pry into her relations with her husband and her own affairs prior to the time she came into the Corwell case, the woman's chin quivered and her eyes filled with tears. The court stopped the examination on that line immediately. The judge did not allow that in. It's true. A few weeks before that, Hyrel's husband had shot his lover and killed himself. So the events leading up to that story, in November in Pasadena, George Gill, in the guise of a neglectful husband, was brought before the justice this evening, a charge of omission to provide. The wife is the complaining witness, and he was admitted to bail. The case involves domestic tragedy. Not so very long ago, Mrs. Gill followed her husband to Ocean Park. There, it charged, he found him the guest of a fascinating widow, at or near whose residence there was a lively little row which terminated when Gill returned to Pasadena. This episode lost Gill his place with the Kendall Company, a large real estate firm of Pasadena, and Gill and his wife are said to have had several quarrels since. I mean, I read one article, I couldn't even take this one seriously. There was whips and things happening. I don't know about that one. Finally, Gill departed and was last located by the wife in Venice. Mrs. Gill has gone to work as a real estate saleswoman. She's said to be doing very well. Now that actually will come into play in Hyrel's life later, but this is in 1908. Working woman. Both husband and wife are well connected, and the affair and sensational rarest this evening has caused something of a sensation. Mrs. Gill has announced that her husband has shown her absolutely no mercy through their unpleasant notoriety, and she says that she proposes to show him none. Sensational evidence will probably be brought out when the case comes to trial, if it is ever allowed to progress so far as that. It is said that the name of the fascinating widow will be brought out compromisingly, and that Mrs. Gill has accumulated about the spiciest lot of evidence ever exhibited in a Pasadena courtroom. Quiet Pasadena has sensation. Husband denies charges in court. Jury disagrees. 8 voting for acquittal and 4 for conviction. Denies woman in the case. The most sensational action ever tried in Pasadena held attention in Justice McDonald's court this afternoon when Mrs. Hyrel Gill had a hearing of her charge that her husband, George Gill, had not contributed to her support or the support of their child for some weeks. The charge against Gill was one of omission to provide, and after some deliberation, the jury reported that no agreement could possibly be reached. It is understood that the jury polled 8 for acquittal and 4 for conviction when the last ballot was cast. Mrs. Gill is the woman who some weeks ago created a sensation at Redondo by having an altercation with her husband, whom she charged was stopping with another woman. A rather disgraceful scene is charged to the couple on that occasion. The most sensational features of the case today were the letters introduced. In these letters, Gill says that he will starve rather than do anything for his wife, that she has ruined his life and, quotes, killed him and, quotes, put him on the hog. He also says that, quotes, if a man ever does hate a woman, I do certainly hate you. In retaliation, a letter from Mrs. Gill was also introduced in which she mentions enough unpaid bills to partly explain why George left home. However, her letters were the more dignified of the two. Both Mr. and Mrs. Gill got into a lively little squabble as to whether or not the wife had abstracted $14.75 from his trouser pockets while he slept on the evening previous to his departure. He also charged that she had taken several articles rightfully belonging to him and had refused to turn over the goods. An effort was made to show that Gill is at present sequestering in the sunshine of other society. This testimony Gill resented much more than he did any allusions reflecting on his lawful wife. In fact, he rose to champion the cause in a truly remarkable manner, as with flashing eyes he denied that there is any other woman in the case at all. Flashing. A love-mad woman succumbs to wounds. Redondo murders, crimes were premeditated. Up to the very last, his wife believed in him. Hyrel. Mrs. May Watkins, the beautiful victim of love-mad George Gill, died at the California hospital late yesterday afternoon after having failed to survive an operation performed by the hospital surgeons in an effort to locate the bullet. It was found that the bullet from the revolver of the jealous lover had glanced from her shoulder blade, tearing through the muscles of her back, lodging against her lower spine. The death of Mrs. Watkins followed on the discovery of a letter written to an attorney by Gill. Allender, who had been Gill's friend some years ago and stood by the latter during some trouble in Pasadena, Mrs. Gill stated yesterday, this is Hyrel, that she believed Mrs. Watkins killed Gill and then attempted suicide. The letter to Allender proves the contrary, that the case was premeditated. Well, George Gill wrote in this letter, "When you get this letter, all will be over," he said in his last message. "I have always considered you my friend, and I want you to think well of me even after I have departed. I have come here to do what I have done, and I hope you will not think badly of me because of what I have done." The letter was dated Wednesday morning and evidently written by Gill a short time after he left home and started on his journey to the beach home of his affinity, which is Mrs. Watkins, the woman he shot. He also wrote a note to the coroner, and it confirmed the evidence of intended murder and suicide. He did write a letter to the coroner of Los Angeles as follows: "Dear Sir, I detest trouble and detest to make it, but will acknowledge. I am down and out and have slipped the last cog. I have premeditated this, so bring it in a clear case of felo de se, Latin. Mrs. B.M. Watkins," who is actually dead at the reading of this, but okay. "Mrs. B.M. Watkins will take charge of my remains. To my wife, Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill, I have written, giving her authority to get my personal belongings, jewelry, etc. They are for my boy, Dorian. So have arranged everything. Okay, I think. This thing takes a little nerve. Have been drinking so much since I went to Frisco that I am not myself. Sorry for all this trouble. Still, it is in your line. Do the right thing by me and accept obligations from yours, G.A. Gill." When Hyrel learned of her husband's death, she was deeply affected and stated that she did not think her husband had been guilty of the killing. She really thought May Watkins had killed him. She and the dead woman had battled for months for the affection of the man. Each loved him with a love that bordered on insanity. They fought for him as only women can. In a desperate hope that the other woman might give her husband back to her, Mrs. Gill called on Mrs. Watkins. She went down on her knees to her rival and begged her to give him up, the voice of passion. Let's assume that in this little bit that this is Hyrel talking, because Mrs. Watkins was dead. The answer caused Mrs. Gill to flee the house in terror. Quotes, "I will not give him up until he is dead. I love him," was the answer of the affinity. Mrs. Watkins. "He is the world and all heaven to me. I will have him or know that he is dead. If he leaves me, he cannot live. That is how I love him. I love the ground he walks on. I will not give him up." According to Hyrel, when Gill later visited Mrs. Watkins and spoke of his wife, she, true to her word, whipped out a stiletto and told him that if he deserted her, he must die. Gill tried to break the spell that bound him to the woman of his infatuation. He came to Los Angeles from San Diego. He visited his wife and little boy and wanted them to take him back. He was tired and weary of his jealous affinity. His wife received him with open arms. They were happy for just a day, and then came a summons that the man could not resist. It was the call of the woman to whose love he had sacrificed his manhood. Mrs. Watkins had moved to Redondo. Gill could not bear to be near her and not see her. Her spell gripped him tight. On one hand, his manhood called him to the side of his wife and little boy. On the other, the woman of his fascination stood by the seashore and beckoned him. He grew weary of the fight and decided to end it all, which of course there is no levity in suicide. How well he planned was told by the wife yesterday and by the desperately cool notes written by him to the coroner and to his attorney. When he saw that he could not regain his manhood, Gill bade an affectionate farewell and went to the beach. The woman he could not give up met him there. They were in a room a very few minutes, and then came the shooting. On the inquest, it was death by his own hand. Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill, widow of the deceased, was the first witness. Again, sitting in a trial 2 weeks before she sat in another one. She is an unusually handsome woman and manifestly a person of strong character. In spite of her surroundings and the unfortunate situation in which she was placed, she held herself well under control and gave her testimony in a clear tone of voice. "I am the widow of George A. Gill, the deceased. He was in his 41st year and was a native of England. I don't know exactly where he was born, but his parents live at Wakefield in Yorkshire, England. At the time of his death, he had not been engaged in any business for several months. Prior to that, he'd been in the real estate business. He came to Los Angeles in the spring of 1902, and I followed him a year later. The last time I saw him prior to his death was at Franklin Cafeteria on Broadway. We had lunch together, and he appeared to be in a happy frame of mind. I thought he was better physically and mentally than I had seen him for a long time. We parted at 1 o'clock. He said he was going to Frank Allender's law office to meet Mrs. Bertha M. Watkins. This is May Watkins. He said he would not meet her alone because he was afraid of her. He declared that he had to see her to try to get her to deed back to him some property that had been bought in her name with his money and which was really his, and he wanted it for our son, Dorian. He also wanted to give some money he had given Mrs. Watkins to keep for him. I suppose that everything was at an end with him and was very happy. At lunch, we'd been planning to leave Los Angeles and start somewhere new. In the letter he left his lawyer, it does suggest he was going to take his own life. In the letter he left the coroner, and I'll repeat, "Dear sir, I detest trouble and detest to make it. I'm down and out. I've slipped the last cog. I've premeditated this. Mrs. B.M. Watkins will take charge of my remains. To my wife, Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill, I have written, given her authority to get my personal belongings, jewelry. They are for my boy. So have arranged everything okay, I think." Clearly, he probably didn't intend to kill Mrs. Watkins, his lover. He did probably intend to kill himself, maybe in front of her. And maybe he was just too darn conflicted. But I do find it fascinating that 1 month later, she's testifying in another trial. And that is not the end of Hyrel's story. Hyrel went on years later, and I think this actually went on for years anyway, but by 1920, she's at least back in the newspaper. She owned quite a bit of land, or thought she owned quite a bit of land in Millard Canyon. She owned claims, mining claims, she said. She fought with the federal government and the National Forest Service to keep the land. They were saying it wasn't hers. She had goats that they had to go run off and get rid of. Hyrel went on to stay in the news in the Los Angeles area. Somehow she acquired property in Millard Canyon where she was charging tolls for people to get through for public roads, but she was charging tolls. And the federal government came after her over that. There's a sanatorium up there in the canyon where they were, she and her son, Dorian, had interfered with the water piped into the sanatorium. And when he was arrested, she tried to get in the car. How do they describe this? Mrs. Gill, who is the ruler of Millard's Canyon, where she allows no one to pick flowers without her permission, enjoyed the joke for a little while. They had picked up the wrong boy, and she let that go. And then magnanimously produced her own son and told the officer the mistake that he'd made. The papers were taken back, served on the proper defendant in the case. Preparations were made for the boy to ride into Los Angeles. Gill also attempted to get into the vehicle but was denied the privilege by Dunlap. And oh, with the goats. Now there's goats. Ultimately, in the years between, I don't know when and when, certainly 1916 to 1920, she claimed ownership and mineral rights of Millard Canyon and Arroyo Seco. The government land office ruled that the lands were not valuable for minerals and not legally located because, quotes, dummies were used. She was ordered off the land. I think she left a lot of goats running around up there, which ultimately she and others. In about 1920, open season declared on bad goats. Battling herd in national forest to be exterminated. U.S. attorney was filing suit for damages against owners of a herd in the forest. A ranger Mackenzie had shot and killed 7 of 12, quotes, outlaw goats against which war had been previously declared. The, quotes, outlaws were among those left behind when the federal government recently ousted Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill and others from the forest for conducting a goat farm there instead of working claims filed upon. These goats became wild and often did battle with wayfarers in the Millard Canyon east of Pasadena. Here's a fun headline in 1920. Gill goats have got to go. Federal attorney gets court order to shoot, quotes, butters on site anywhere. Now comes the last reel of Mrs. Hyrel C. Gill and her drove of goats. Yesterday, a district judge signed an order authorizing the forest and rangers on duty to kill the Gill goats on site and do away with the nuisance that has been in the evidence ever since Mrs. Gill finally obeyed the demands of the federal court that she vacate the premises that she'd been occupying for many years in the Angeles National Reserve in defiance of officials. The woman had about 50 goats, but she could not get all of them away, and about a dozen had been infesting the trails in the Millard Canyon. They were too wild to be caught, and they utterly refused to be, quotes, shooed. So U.S. Attorney Bryan yesterday secured the necessary authority to allow the rangers to kill the goats whenever or wherever found. Let's find out what happened to Hyrel. Poor girl. By 1930, Hyrel was living in Los Angeles, working for an advertising agency as an advertiser. She was 56 at the time and living with her 30-year-old son, Richard, who was working as a mechanic. Hyrel died in February of 1940. She died in Los Angeles. I presume she is buried in Los Angeles. And that, my friends, is the story of my cousin, Hyrel Gill, of whom I have a young photo which shows a firm jaw. And if you believe in that, if you believe in small mouths or kind of like small spirits and firm jaws or physically, visually firm jaws suggest a strong character, there's something in it because that girl had a sizable jaw. That is the story of Hyrel and Wyatt, frankly, and Josie, since they were all bouncing around the same trial and probably there on the same days and bumped into each other and said howdy doody. Thanks for listening to my story. Bye.